Thank you for coming here today. That's not Chicago. You probably noticed that already. That's New Orleans after Katrina. And it's there because a few weeks ago, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Illinois Chicago, which had a big event on the 20th anniversary of the heat wave, a kind of reckoning event. And I was walking to the building, and I got a little bit lost. Don't know it over there too well, and I asked a young medical student if he could point me to the building. He said, "Sure, I'll, in great Chicago fashion, I'll walk you over." They don't do that in New York. So he walked me over, and he said, "So what are you here for?" And I said, I'm talking about this big, the anniversary of this big disaster. And he said, "Oh yeah, Katrina, it's the 10th anniversary of Katrina." And I said, "Well, it's true, but actually this is about the Chicago heat wave." And he said, "What Chicago heat wave?" And so here we are, 20 years later. It was totally fine for him to say, "What Chicago heat wave?" and completely predictable, right? I mean, when's the last time you visited the big memorial for the Chicago heat wave of 1995? You remember your last visit there? Or the reenactment, right? I guess the reenactments don't always go well here on disasters, but no, when it comes to the heat wave, we've had a kind of will not to know what went wrong. And the work I've done on this is really about that will not to know. And it's not just a will not to know about what happened during this 1 week in Chicago. It's a will not to know about something much deeper about our city. And that's what I want to talk about today. So it gets hot in Chicago. But in July of 1995, it got unusually hot. The temperature hit 106 degrees. The heat index, which is like wind chill, like what a person feels, got to 126. And it lasted that kind of temperature for about 2.5 days. Not a very long amount of time, but long enough. Meteorologists actually can track the extreme and dangerous heat as it moves up towards a city in the same way that they track dangerous hurricanes. But if you've noticed, we treat those two events very differently, which is to say we do track the hurricane, but we don't track the heat until it arrives. And that's interesting because in typical years, heat waves actually kill more Americans than all of the other so-called natural disasters combined, right? But imagine how we would react if we watched it as it approached and started to prepare. That's not what we did. What we did do instead is we jammed on our air conditioning, right? And so Chicago, that's what we do in the summer. We set a record for energy consumption during the heat wave. We have since shattered that record, of course. And crews had nothing to do other than go and try to spray down the generators to keep the power going. That was the emergency intervention. Guess what didn't work? About 250,000 households lost power, some for a couple days. Now remember, it feels like it's 126. And when the power's out, elevators don't work, right? If you're in a high-rise building. The water pumps can't get water up to higher floors. Obviously, the air conditioning doesn't work either. So the term water wars, and the quality of the slides will get better. These are just from old documents. But the term water wars came from the Chicago Tribune, which reported that in some neighborhoods, every water hydrant was open, every fire hydrant was open, 3,000 at the same time. And in neighborhoods where a lot of the hydrants were open, there were problems maintaining water supply, even to low floors. And so officers from the city were coming to close down the hydrants, and people were saying, that's how we're going to survive this. We're going to open them back up. And there were reports of people throwing rocks, bottles, even a shooting, an attempted shooting at least, around the hydrants. So a fight for basic resources. Basic resources, water, is also what health officials were using to try to cool off kids in the city, because as you recall from your summer days in camp, the way that you get around the city is you jump on these old yellow school buses, which tend not to have air conditioning. And in Chicago that week, roads were buckling, and the plates on the bridges were expanding, so we couldn't open and close bridges normally. Train rails had become unstable because of the intense heat, so this created a major log jam on the roads, and there was massive traffic. So you had kids who were stuck in these buses, and the city just started hosing them down too, and bringing water to try to relieve them. That also did not work. During the heat wave, about half of the city's hospitals went on bypass status, which means that they closed down, they closed their doors, they could not take any new emergency patients. Okay, so imagine you have thousands of patients in excess of the norm who are coming in seeking urgent treatment for heat-related illnesses. The faster you treat them, the more likely you are that the person will survive or stay healthy. Unfortunately, not only did the city have to close down the hospitals, but the city had no system for monitoring which hospitals were open and which were closed. So an ambulance would come and be turned away and then have to hope that they could find the next hospital that was open. There were reports of paramedics driving for up to 10 miles trying to find a bed where someone could get emergency treatment. And of course that meant that there were delays in the system that kept other people from getting ambulances on time as well. While this is happening, the city gets involved in this incredible debate because people start to die. When they do, the mayor's taken by surprise. It didn't seem right to him. It didn't seem right to city leadership. And in fact, one of the amazing things about this event is, say, unlike a hurricane, where you have this advance warning and you can track the system coming through, if the heat just arrives and people aren't paying much attention to it, you don't do basic things to watch out. The mayor turned out to be in his beach house. The fire commissioner, who runs the paramedics, in the beach house. The health commissioner, also on vacation. Now, this can sound moralistic, but I don't mean it that way. I think of it sociologically, right? Because in this city, as in so many cities and so many societies, when it gets very hot, the leaders, the elite, leave town. They go to cool off. That's structural, we'd say. That's part of the way things work. It's not a moral matter that people who run agencies go away on vacation when it's uncomfortable. But it becomes a political issue when you don't have a system that recognizes risks and real dangers, and when people don't know that they should pay attention. So one of the consequences of the leadership being gone is that people who are running the agencies that could have done more didn't know or didn't feel confident that they could, say, call in additional ambulances, pay for more paramedics to be on the job. They didn't feel comfortable making those calls because there was not an official city emergency. As it happens, the city of Chicago actually had a heat emergency plan on the books, but no one remembered to use it. For me, one of the really strange things that started to happen in this story that captured my interest when I first started working on it is that rather than get into emergency relief mode right away when the medical examiner began to report on fatalities, the mayor began to challenge the scientific validity of the death reports. Specifically, there was a fight between the mayor and the medical examiner that lasted several days over whether the deaths were really real, whether we were counting everything as a heat death. And to give you a sense of the legacy of this debate, a few weeks ago at the UIC conference, Ed Donahue, the medical examiner here for many years, came and gave a talk and still could not stop talking about this dispute. It defined the experience for him to have his scientific claims that people were dying of the heat challenged by the mayor instead of having the mayor go into an emergency mode. And this is the consequence. 739 people in excess of the norm died during the worst week between July 14th and July 20th of 1995, 20 years ago. 739 people. A massive disaster, significantly more deadly than the fire, for instance. And what was really disturbing to so many people who followed the event is people in Chicago didn't just die. Hundreds died alone and were discovered hours or days after they perished. This is disturbing for all of us who care about the city, right? Because we are a city of neighborhoods. We are a city that works. We're a city that is integrated, that doesn't let things like this happen. And so I think part of that will not to know I talked about in the beginning, part of the difficulty we've had as a city coming to terms with what happened here is that this is not just a story of a mayor's failure or of a political breakdown. This is a story of a sweeping set of social breakdowns in which we're all implicated in some way that's a little hard to get our hands around. Many people commented that one of the real tragedies of this event is that heat is actually pretty easy to defend against, right? Once you recognize that the heat is dangerous, you just have to immerse someone in an air-conditioned environment or in water, and they will survive. And hundreds of people did not get the personal attention and the refrigeration until after they died. So as this starts to play out, Chicago's media got very involved in this story. And this was the big question, who's to blame? Whose fault is it when something like this happens? Where do we point the finger? And I understand that impulse, but I don't think that's the most productive way to approach this. How do we think about who died and why they died? Well, there were immediate suggestions that came from both journalistic organizations and from the city itself. The Tribune had this amazing headline for one of its major stories about the heat wave. The casualties of the heat were just like most of us, and that many of the victims rejected any kind of help. That's an amazing story if you think about it, right? So it's got two big claims in it. One is the heat wave just killed kind of a random sample of Chicagoans, just like you and me. Could have been us. And the second is that what really happened is that people were going around knocking on doors of older and poor, isolated, frail, vulnerable people saying, please let us help you. And they were saying, no, 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 go away. And you will still hear people in Chicago tell that story, that they knocked on doors and people rejected the help. There's another story, which it goes in line with that came from the Commissioner of Human Services at the time, which is basically people died because they neglected themselves. It's their fault. There's other views too. One of the sources for my research on what happened inside the city was a guy who was a high-level person in the paramedics group who has called this event murder by public policy, right? Because the city failed to do things that it easily could have done and should have done and knew to do had it been paying attention. You shouldn't have to write a book on an event like this to answer those questions, because we should live in a place that answers those questions on its own, right? So you would expect that if 730-some people die in the city, that what we would do is have city hearings, right? We'd have an open public inquiry to try to figure out what went wrong. And yet, the city of Chicago refused to hold any public hearings on what happened here. It's not just that we don't have a memorial. It's that we would not hold hearings. And when the Tribune reported deep inside the Metro section one day that the city would hold no hearings, that was the headline. So I was about to start graduate school in 1995 at Berkeley, and I thought I'd look into this. I came back to Chicago right before I moved to California to visit family and started having these conversations about the event, and I couldn't believe the stories people were telling me. It just sounded surreal. And I started this investigation. I called it a social autopsy because the idea was that in the same way that a medical examiner would open up a body and try to pinpoint the organs that broke down and caused a death, that I would use the tools of social science to do that with the city. And do a social autopsy and try to understand not, whether it was murder by public policy. I was not involved in a trial. Not to see whether it was the mayor's fault. I knew it was much deeper than that. But what else was happening in Chicago that made that event so much more deadly than it had to have been? And the first thing I did was to look at the neighborhoods, right? What places in Chicago were the most vulnerable? Where were the deaths concentrated? And this is a room full of people who know exactly what that map means, right? That's a map of poverty and a map of the areas with high heat-related death, and that's also a map of the Black Belt. Right? That's what segregation by race in Chicago looks like, more or less. But it's more interesting than that. I looked really closely at the neighborhoods that had high death rates and also the neighborhoods that had low death rates to try to figure out what conditions explain why some neighborhoods that look pretty similar on paper actually had very different death rates during the event. Not every neighborhood that looked vulnerable fared badly, and not every neighborhood that looked resilient fared well. That's Englewood, right? Which extremely poor, high levels of crime, decent number of older people living alone. That's Auburn Gresham, right across the street. Very similar levels of poverty, very similar levels of older people who are living alone. Slightly less crime than Englewood. But a neighborhood where on paper it looks like you would find a very high death rate as well. And amazingly, in the heat wave, the death rate in Englewood was about 10 times higher than Auburn Gresham. And what's happening there? Is it about the culture of the different communities? Is it about people caring for each other? I don't think so, and that's not what the evidence suggests. What the evidence tells us is that it's not those things that matter so much as the social infrastructure, what I've come to call the social infrastructure, the physical layout of the neighborhood, the sidewalks, the streets, the density of commercial establishments, the density of community organizations that animate the social life of a place, right? And if you live in a neighborhood like this, which as it happens also has more commercial outlets, it's much easier to be drawn out into the streets for social life and for connection, to go to public places where you'll find support. Whereas if you live in a neighborhood that looks like that, no matter how much you care about your neighbors, older people especially are much more likely to hunker down and stay indoors when they feel unsafe. And so the neighborhoods that had high death rates in Chicago were neighborhoods that were depleted, abandoned. They weren't just poor, they weren't just African American. They'd had this devastated social infrastructure. And here's something that really surprised me and that no one had looked at before I worked on this project. If you look at the neighborhoods that had the lowest death rates in the city, the places where residents were most likely to survive, you find, surprisingly, a number of three entirely African-American neighborhoods there. There's Auburn Gresham, but also Calumet Heights, also Riverdale. You wouldn't expect that from the way we conventionally talk about this. But what all of the neighborhoods that had low death rates had in common is that while the city of Chicago was shrinking, while the population was declining dramatically, 22% of the population of Chicago declined in the decades leading up to that. Every single one of them had a population decline level that was lower than the city average. They were places that kept their social infrastructure intact. And it's my view that that's what made up the difference between life and death. There's a few haunting images from this week that I still have trouble reckoning with, that I think also make it difficult for us collectively to to address what happened and what it means for Chicago. This image is one of them. After the disaster, there were dozens of bodies that were never claimed by next of kin. And that's how we buried them. And it turns out that that's how we bury them all the time. Every year, there's hundreds of people who die alone and have no one to come to claim the body or the estate in Chicago. And this burial took place not even in the city of Chicago, but in Homewood. We had no place for them in life or in death. But in a way, this is the more chilling image for me. I'm guessing you've never seen this before. And I said that the city of Chicago had no public hearings on what happened during the heat wave. But the mayor did have a commission that looked into what went wrong, and the mayor used that commission to generate some knowledge internally and to produce a heat plan, which is actually not a bad heat plan. I'll talk about it in a little bit. But when they published it after the disaster, this was the cover. And I find it chilling in a kind of Orwellian way for a few reasons. One of them, as you might have noticed, is that the phrase heat wave does not occur on this, which is the major city report on what happened that week. And the other, as I'm sure you've noticed by now, is that there's a snowflake. Publish to hide. Why does it matter that we didn't really tell the story well, that we didn't do public knowledge, that there was no large, big conversation that moved out of Chicago into the world based on our soul-searching process of coming to terms with what happened? Because when in 2003, a 3-week heat wave hit Europe, and the death toll was somewhere between 35 and 70,000, in excess of the norm, depending on how you measure it. Almost every single European political official said, nothing like this has ever happened before. How could we have known that the heat would be so deadly? When I initially wrote Heat Wave, it was the early 2000s, and the debate about climate change was not much of a debate in the social sciences. There were other places that were taking it up, but that whole issue of global warming belonged to other people, not to us. But of course, the world has changed since then. You can't write a book or tell a story about a heat wave without referring to the weather that's coming. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about what comes next. This is a chart that you're probably familiar with. If not, you will be soon. It's, maps the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the global temperature. There's a strong relationship. And we can expect not just a gradual warming of the planet, but also, more specifically, hotter, longer, and more frequent heat waves. Right? And this is not a controversial statement by any means. Right? So you've probably read a little bit over the last couple of days about the big hurricane in Mexico, and you've seen climate scientists saying the water is warmer, and there's more evaporated water in the air, and that kind of gives storms energy to be more powerful than they had been before. It's like the weather system on steroids. It's a little bit like that for heat in Chicago. So this is coming. And every year in July, it gets hot in Chicago, and I start to get tons of phone calls from reporters. This is the bane of my family's summer vacation plan. And they want to know, well, what does Chicago do now? And so let me say, to be totally clear, that Chicago has one of the best heat emergency plans in the world. I mean, when the city of Chicago is about to have a heat wave, you hear about it on the radio and on television, right? Everybody is on alert. Political officials work with local media. We're told to check in on our neighbors and family members. They're very aggressive about monitoring the weather in ways we didn't before. The city has done wonders to locate and to identify and to contact vulnerable people, older people, people who live alone, people who are most likely to die in a heat wave. We do monitor the hospitals now, so we know which ones are open and which ones are closed. And of course, we declare an official heat emergency. right? We would never make that mistake again. And so Chicago is in some ways a model for a heat emergency plan. Does it make you feel safe? So the power went out in 1995. Remember, the heat wave just lasted a couple days, whereas the heat wave in Europe that killed tens of thousands of people lasted 3 weeks. How many of you feel very confident that on an extremely hot day in Chicago, followed by another and another, that you will have access to energy? That your elevator will work, that your water will run, that your air conditioning will work? You feel good about the power grid in Chicago? Have we tackled that problem, Chicago? Because when I was on this panel at UIC a few weeks ago, and there were several people who worked on the heat wave who came from the city who said, Chicago, we've got this covered. We have a great heat emergency plan. And I thought, you do? It used to be the case that to live here was to take for granted that we would have electricity when we needed it most, right? But I don't think anybody in any major American city feels that way now. Right? We're running on a very old infrastructure that can't handle the load. How about the public health system in Chicago? We feel good that people are not so vulnerable, that if the extreme heat hits, we'll be taken care of, we'll be able to take care of each other. Kids will be fine. Older people will be healthy enough to resist. The population we have of more than 100,000 people over 65 living alone, we've got them covered? I'm guessing not. The healthcare system, more generally, is it up to the demands of the 3-week heat wave? Here's something chilling about a 3-week heat wave. We learned a lot about France. You remember in 2003, it was the French heat wave. Everyone talked about the 15,000 deaths were initially reported in France. And that was a heat wave that lasted 3 weeks. And then I looked into it, and I realized something startling, which is that the death rate in France from a heat wave that lasted 3 weeks was the same, almost to the number, as the death rate in Chicago from a heat wave that lasted 3 days. So think about what would happen here if or when that 3-week heat wave arrives. And think about how the hospital system would work to deal with those cases. I don't think we've solved this problem either. Neighborhood inequality. Wouldn't you expect the same neighborhoods to have the same kinds of outcomes that they did last time? But it's more than that, because when I look closely at the numbers for places like Englewood and Auburn Gresham, again, statistically not so dissimilar, just across the street from each other. It's not just that people who live in this neighborhood are 10 times more likely to die in a heat wave. It's that the life expectancy every day is 5 years lower than it is across the street. That's the penalty. And the change in Chicago since then is not such a happy story. This is a study from the University of Illinois Chicago that just shows community changes in terms of poverty levels. And unfortunately, the places that are most vulnerable have either stayed the same or have gotten worse. It's hard to see that, right, when you walk downtown, when you go to Millennium Park, when you see the skyscrapers, the harbors, the walkways. I mean, Chicago has never looked better. Chicago has never looked better, except for this. What's the heat emergency plan in some bigger sense? You know, how is Chicago going to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, going to update the infrastructure? There's a plan. You know, there's a plan for doing it. But it's my sense that this is not a plan that's being attended to by citizens in the way that it might be. Right, we're here to talk about citizens today. It's my sense that this is not a plan that's going to work unless this is an issue for citizens, an issue that citizens drive as well. And that citizens will need to hold the leaders of the city accountable, because without it, this chart is going to be a fantasy document. Chicago's not the only city struggling with these issues. And I single out Chicago because we're here, and I'm of it. But when I moved, the extreme weather came with me. If you're planning to relocate, you might want to call me first and get yourself a few thousand miles away. A very wise strategy. That's Sandy, about 1,000 miles wide as it was approaching the Northeast. And that's a neighborhood not too far from where I live, a very affluent neighborhood in Lower Manhattan, after the water breached the city 3 years ago next week. Next week is the 3-year anniversary. You'll hear a lot about that anniversary. Sandy was catastrophic in ways that are worth us paying attention to, and not just because of this week's weather in Mexico. 8 million households lost their power during Sandy. There, as in many other places, we have this amazing technology for keeping the power running. We use a pole, and then we have the power lines go just below these giant trees with big limbs, and they fall down every time, and millions of people lose power. In Long Island, where this image was taken, what's amazing is that the Power Authority had a meeting a few days before Sandy hit, where they were dealing with all sorts of things, except for not Sandy. They spent 37 seconds discussing Sandy plans and failed to prune trees and do a lot of other preparations. They actually have now moved out of the region, and there's a new contractor there, a new utilities provider. The subways filled up like bathtubs in New York City. And what's incredible about this image is that it's 86th Street, and the flooding was nowhere near there, right? Extremely vulnerable, the built-in infrastructure of a place like New York. The city proved vulnerable in all kinds of surprising ways. As I think about the challenge that Chicago and other cities face for this world of hotter, wilder, wetter weather, I look to examples from different places in the world, and also to some innovations that I got to participate in, because we are now in a situation where we have no choice but to rebuild our cities and our infrastructures in anticipation of climate extremes. Right? In the same way that we worked on homeland security after September 11th, we are entering into a period where climate security will be necessary. We literally will have no choice. So for the last several years, I've worked on this project called Rebuild by Design. It's a project initiated by President Obama and his task force on Sandy. And the idea was to say, we can't just build back what was destroyed in New York and in the region that was hit by Sandy. We have to rebuild and with more intelligent design, right? And so what I want to talk to you about to conclude are some of the interesting things that are happening in New York and that are starting to happen in cities everywhere to rebuild cities so that they can deal with the threats of global warming, but not in the way that we dealt with the threats from Homeland Security, which is to build up these massive walls and security systems that really do nothing most of the time and may or may not help when the next attack comes. What they certainly do is they make life kind of uglier and less efficient every day, if you've been to an airport or a high-rise building recently. But we can't make that mistake with climate change, right? We have to make designs that improve the quality of our lives and our cities every day, and also make us safer when the extreme weather hits. So we tried to do that. One of the, we got 148 plans or proposals submitted from these big international teams. It was extraordinary. 10 became finalists, 6 were selected and got $1 billion of funding from the federal government last year. This is one of them called the Big U, which is to say, what could we do to provide some protection around New York that's short of having giant walls in the middle of the sea to try to block it out? That's the image of what happened when the power went out in in New York, that there is kind of an iconography of Sandy. There isn't really one for the heat wave. If you close your eyes and try to picture the Chicago heat wave, you can't do it, but you can see this. So this group called the Big U has come up with a plan to try to harden the edge of the city with walls, but walls that look really differently, that look very different than the conventional wall. I'm just going to take you through some of the design ideas so you can see what it could look like to rebuild a riverfront area so that you're safer as a resident there, but that you also get benefits all the time. Right? That's one of the proposals from the Big U that was, it's funded actually, not on the, this is the west side of Manhattan. It actually, interestingly, got funded on the east side of Manhattan, where there's a real thick concentration of public housing and low-income neighborhoods. And so we made a public decision that that would be the area that we fund because that's a more vulnerable place, and the people are more vulnerable, and they have greater need for that kind of assistance. And that's a real problem when it comes to climate change adaptation, which is once we start this effort of not only mitigating, not only trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also trying to do climate security to keep some people and places safe, there's an enormous risk that we will lock in inequalities and create new forms of environmental injustice, right? That the most affluent people and places will be able to protect themselves against the ravages of climate change, while the poorest will be left in harm's way. Nothing short of citizens working together to push governments not to let that happen, right? To invest in places that need investment most will prevent that, right? So that's New York, just a sample of a way for a city to take on this issue. It's expensive, it's difficult, but it's necessary. What's happened in Chicago since the big heat wave in 1995? How have we thought about greening the city to cool it down? Right? If New York needs protection from too much water, Chicago needs protection from too much heat. Chicago needs a way to integrate people in the most vulnerable neighborhoods to make sure that the city works as it should, that agencies deliver the support that they can, that we're helping each other out, not just in bad weather, but all the time. So by far the most high-profile green site of Chicago these last several years has been the Green Roof. Has anyone been here to the Green Roof on City Hall? It's an amazing green roof. And it's a model. You know, people come from all over the world to look at the Green Roof. And it was done with philanthropic dollars. I don't think that public money went into it. And it really is this kind of a successful exemplar of how we can use new materials or old materials to absorb the heat, to bring down especially those evening temperatures, which are hotter in the city than outside. So I applaud the Green Roof for Chicago, but it doesn't do much for the issues we talked about today. The Green Roof and City Hall won't do all that much for the neighborhoods where we know people are most likely to suffer. So my favorite image for Chicago is not an image of a major infrastructure project. It's not seawalls. It's not a multi-million-dollar roof on City Hall. I think about the small places in neighborhoods where there's been so much depletion, so much abandonment over the last decades, that you could really use something to enliven the social infrastructure and bring people together. It's striking, you know, how little we have invested collectively in things like community gardens and other small-scale facilities that exist at the neighborhood level, that provide some green space, that maybe make a little dent in the problem of food deserts, right? But that more crucially bring people together across generations where they can establish relationships in the place where they live so that they have connections all the time, but lifelines when they need them most. Could be a neighborhood library, could be some other community center, that's relevant, that works for people all the time. Could be a community garden. But when we think about what cities like Chicago need to do to address this new world we're entering, the story is we have to think large, but we also have to think small. Most importantly, we have to think together. So thank you very much.
Okay, what was the ratio of children to adults? And did the children survive at a much higher ratio?
Yeah, so children were quite unlikely to die. The fatalities were overwhelmingly adult and overwhelmingly elderly. Roughly 70% of the deaths were people over the age of 65. Not to say that children weren't vulnerable. In fact, there's a heartbreaking story, and it's actually one of the main scenes of this terrific local playwright, Steve Simonchik, did a theatrical adaptation of Heat Wave. It's run twice now, most recently at the Steppenwolf Festival. And I think the first reported deaths were these two toddlers who were left in a big van that their daycare provider had put them in because they didn't have air conditioning and they wanted to get to a place where the kids could cool down, so they drove to a movie theater. And she had, 10 kids or something, and she forgot about two of them. And you'll notice, once you start to pay attention to these issues that this often happens in summers that, people forget children in cars. But the other thing that happens with kids is that they get very sick because we think that they're fine and we don't recognize the danger of heat, and so they play as if it's a cool day and wind up getting dehydrated. And so the hospitalizations of children are higher. Thanks.
I'm wondering whether you can talk a little bit about the global nature of the problem as opposed to the local. And I'm just thinking in terms of right now, and we'll be talking about this later today too. The Syrian crisis starts out as a global warming crisis, as desertification and so forth. You can get these terrible migration flows. But is it completely utopian and fantastical to imagine that one could help, for example, by having tens of thousands of the current Syrian refugees come to cities in America that have been depleted, abandoned, and so forth, where there is housing stock that's empty, that they could help to revitalize those neighborhoods, and that one could think more imaginatively if one weren't kind of locked down the way we are as a country about that.
Yeah, so that's Ren Weschler, by the way, who's the former artistic director of the Humanities Festival. And clearly not going to be running for a Republican candidate for senator or for president anytime soon. So, could our cities fare better if we were more welcoming, if we lived up to our history of being a place where, we would accept massive numbers of immigrants during times of crisis where they live? I think that question pretty much answers itself. Could we use that kind of imagination? Yes, we could use it. So you could run for office in some other party, perhaps. And I think that issue is yet to play out. But so let me move to the first part of your question, which has to do with these bigger security issues and issues of health and well-being that don't always appear to be about climate change, but that in fact have a real relationship to global warming, because we are seeing now with the kind of extreme drought or flooding that's been hitting with more frequency, the beginning of what climate scientists predict will be long waves of migration, right, when water supplies run out. Right? So we don't know how California or Nevada are going to get water. But imagine conditions like that in much poorer regions of the world. Right? Our food supply chains are incredibly vulnerable to the new weather extremes that we'll see. And just this issue of sea level rise generating coastal inundation means that in the next century, up to 1 billion people might have to leave the places they live because they will be uninhabitable. Right? So, we are looking at a world with huge changes. I've written a lot about climate change adaptation and resilience because we don't have any choice. If I had a magic button right now and I just turned off all greenhouse gas emissions globally, we would still have many decades of rising seas and hotter temperatures because of the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. So we have no choice to adapt. But as you could tell from what I said earlier, I do fear that this process of adapting to climate change is going to be extraordinarily unequal and will introduce all kinds of new issues for us to manage. So these are lively matters for citizens everywhere, and I anticipate that the Humanities Festival will be addressing them again.
I was wondering, like in a city like Phoenix, Arizona, they live with heat like this for months at a time, and you kind of cherry-picked a problem. In Chicago that's more of an anomaly. The converse of that is really the cold in Chicago. That's a problem because it's much more frequent. And so I was wondering if that perception that the problem is so non-routine that, we're more concerned about protecting us from the cold as opposed to the heat is a reason why maybe the city itself is not prepared to really put the focus on something like this.
Yeah, thank you. Totally fair question. So I have a couple different kinds of responses to it. The first is, and I hope this makes sense to you, I'm not really here to talk about the heat. I'm here to talk about the heat in a very explicit way, and this is to talk about the heat wave 20 years later. But one thing I want to convey to you today is that the issues that are really relevant, the issues for why Chicago was vulnerable to this and why people in Chicago are vulnerable all the time, are not necessarily issues about hot weather. Some of them are social issues about isolation or about breakdowns, and some of them are political issues about how we deal with vulnerability and address the needs of people who are really in trouble. And some are about extreme weather, whether it's heat or cold. I'm certainly not here to tell you that don't worry about the very cold winters. We'll strangely wind up with more of those too, potentially, if the weirdness that climate scientists see in the weather really happens. So I hope that you walk out of the room today feeling like what I had to say was about the heat wave, but about something else as well. On the heat, though, it does turn out to be the case that heat waves are growing more dangerous, that we should expect to see more of them, that we should expect them to be hotter, that we should expect them to last longer as we move into this climate-changed world. And I think, when we look at things like this hurricane this past weekend in Mexico, we're already starting to see, or Sandy, we're already starting to see signs of weather systems that are powerful in ways we hadn't seen before. Where I think you're totally right is that we have long identified a climate risk of being in this region as coping with extreme cold. Right? I grew up in enough winters here to know that you've got to get that one addressed. And we've built an infrastructure to make sure that people in the city get heat, so that we don't have people die in blizzards and deep cold snaps. As it happens, when you have a spike in homelessness, you see a spike in cold deaths. You also see it in heat deaths. In Phoenix, the other city you mentioned, it turns out that they actually have a major problem with heat deaths that they hadn't recognized because people were dying when they were exposed and homeless. And no one was recognizing the relationship between spikes in mortality and the heat until epidemiologists went back and did it. We have different kinds of vulnerabilities. But what we're seeing all over the world is that changes in the climate are making cities that never had to deal with one kind of risk suddenly have to deal with that in addition to all the old ones. So thanks.
Two of the neighborhoods that you studied, Inglewood and Auburn Gresham, have blocks with organized block clubs. Did the existence of a block club make any difference in the number of fatalities, and how did the vacant lots affect it?
Yeah. Unfortunately, so here's what we know. We know that the neighborhoods that had a higher density, we know that neighborhoods that have a higher density of community organizations fare better generally than neighborhoods that don't. Unfortunately, I don't have great data at the block level of whether the existence of a block club was sufficient to bring down the likelihood of a heat death. I just don't know the answer to that question. I do know the answer to the second question, though, which is, what about the empty lots? And there, we actually have a really strong data from people who were able to create a new data set that looked at physical conditions of different Chicago neighborhoods, and they established a positive relationship between levels of abandonment and depletion, specifically around abandoned houses, and heat deaths. There's a paper published in the American Sociological Review, kind of the gold standard of sociology journals. And I think that's important to note. There have been real costs associated with the depletion of Chicago neighborhoods. Right? The city shrunk over the last 3 decades, between 1960 and 1990. It shrunk quite dramatically, but of course that shrinkage was not shared equally. And at the same time that there were neighborhoods that were booming and prosperous, the parts of the city that were most affected by this heat wave experienced devastating losses that I think they're still struggling to get over. Right? I mean, the situation in Englewood is maybe a little better, but in some ways not all that different than it was in 1995. So this is a formidable project, right? It's a project about remaking Chicago for the weather that's coming, but it's also really a harder project about remaking Chicago all the time. And so a book about a heat wave is a very modest contribution to this. But I guess my deepest goal in doing it and continuing to talk about it and writing a new edition is that it strikes me that this condition, this will not to know, just can't be sustained. It's something we have to change. So, thank you very much.